Hey everyone, I hope you enjoy this. If you do, feel free to let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Wishing you a great time watching. Hey Reddit, I never thought I'd be here writing about my wife, Melissa, and our once seemingly perfect life. But here I am, unraveling memories as I try to make sense of where it all went wrong. Melissa and I met when we were both in college, me majoring in computer science, her in physical education with a focus on sports psychology. She was this whirlwind of energy and ambition, and I was just a guy in awe of her. Melissa was a competitive figure skater back then. She'd spent years perfecting her craft, even competing at regional levels. Her passion for the sport was infectious. I remember spending countless hours watching her practice, mesmerized by how graceful and determined she was. Our relationship grew quickly. Late-night study sessions, road trips to her competitions, and quiet moments in between where she'd let her guard down and just be Melissa, not the athlete everyone expected her to be. We got married 5 years after we met. It was a small ceremony, just close family and friends, because Melissa said she didn't want the fuss. She joked that she'd rather put the money toward a pair of custom skates or a weekend getaway. That was Melissa, practical, passionate, and always with one foot on the ice, ready for the next challenge. Life was good. I got a decent job in tech, and Melissa started coaching young skaters while maintaining her training schedule. She even began working with a renowned figure skating coach, Brian, to refine her technique. I was proud of her, of how dedicated she was to chasing her dreams. But looking back now, I wonder if I should have seen the cracks forming earlier. The late nights at the rink, the constant strategy meetings with Brian, the way her phone would light up with his name more often than mine. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Melissa was driven, and Brian was just another part of her journey to the top, or so I thought. That's all for now, folks. I'll share more soon. Melissa's world revolved around the rink, and for a while, I loved being part of it. Her excitement was infectious, and I admired how she threw herself into every practice session and competition like it was the most important moment of her life. It wasn't just a passion, it was her identity, and I supported that wholeheartedly. But as the years passed, something shifted. It started subtly. She'd come home later than usual, saying she and Brian had decided to go over some new routines after practice. "We're working on nailing the triple Lutz," she'd say with that determined smile of hers. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Her work ethic was one of the reasons I fell for her, and Brian, well, he was her coach, a no-nonsense guy who'd been in the sport for decades. But then came the cancellations. Date nights pushed aside because she was too tired after practice, or because Brian needed extra feedback on their routine. Weekends where we'd planned to do something together suddenly turned into solo trips to the rink because Brian thought her technique was slipping. "Don't you ever take a break?" I asked her one night as she walked in well past midnight, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. She rolled her eyes, dropping her bag by the door. "You don't just take breaks when you're trying to get somewhere, Ethan. Not everyone works 9 to 5 and calls it a day." That stung, but I let it go. She was under pressure, and I didn't want to be the guy standing in the way of her dreams. The real red flag came a few weeks later during a tournament out of town. Melissa had begged me to come, said it was one of the biggest events of the season and that she needed me there. So I did, taking off work and sitting in the freezing arena while she dazzled the judges with her routine. She was incredible, as always, and I was so proud of her. But when the competition ended, she seemed distracted, hurried even. "I'll catch up with you later," she said, waving me off as the team celebrated. "Brian wants to go over some footage before tomorrow." I spent the rest of the evening wandering through an unfamiliar city, eating dinner alone, and trying not to feel like an afterthought. When she finally returned to the hotel that night, she was brimming with excitement. "We worked on a new strategy for my spins," she said, tossing her coat onto the chair. "Brian says if I can perfect it, I'll have a real shot at nationals next year." I wanted to share her excitement, but something about the way she said his name, like it wasn't just professional admiration, made my stomach churn. "Seems like you and Brian spent a lot of time together," I said cautiously. Her eyes narrowed, and her tone turned defensive. "Of course we do. He's my coach. What's your point?" "No point," I muttered, deciding to let it drop. But that night, as I lay awake listening to her, even breathing beside me, A nagging thought took root in my mind. Something didn't feel right. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her to something or someone I couldn't compete with. And that's when I started paying closer attention. After that competition, things only got stranger. Melissa's focus on skating became all-consuming, and her time at home dwindled to almost nothing. She'd leave early in the morning, well before the sun was up, and return long after I'd gone to bed. If I ever tried to wait up for her, she'd give me the same tired excuse. You wouldn't understand, Ethan. It's not just practice. It's strategy, choreography, and conditioning. It's everything. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the distance between us kept growing, and no matter how hard I tried to reach her, it felt like she was slipping further and further away. One night, I decided to surprise her at the rink. It was unplanned. I just finished work early and thought it would be nice to watch her practice like I used to. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars, including Brian's familiar black SUV. I walked inside, the chill of the rink biting at my face as I scanned the ice. There she was, gliding effortlessly across the rink in her signature blue leotard. But she wasn't alone. Brian stood at the edge of the rink, watching her intently, a little too intently for my liking. He wasn't just coaching her. There was something else in the way he looked at her, something that made my chest tighten. Melissa didn't notice me at first. She was too focused on executing her routine, but Brian must have said something because she suddenly skated over to him, laughing as she playfully bumped his shoulder. I froze. It wasn't the kind of laugh she shared with everyone. It was the kind of laugh she used to save for me. Before I could stop myself, I walked down to the edge of the rink, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty arena. Melissa's smile vanished the moment she saw me. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp, almost accusatory. "I thought I'd surprise you," I said, forcing a smile. "Looks like you're working hard." Brian glanced between us, his expression unreadable. "Melissa's been making a lot of progress," he said, stepping forward to extend a hand. "Good to see you again, Ethan." I shook his hand reluctantly, my grip tighter than necessary. Likewise, Melissa skated off the ice, grabbing her water bottle as she avoided meeting my eyes. "You should have called," she muttered. "Why? Would it have changed anything?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She didn't answer, and Brian, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. "I'll leave you two to talk. Melissa, great work tonight. We'll pick up where we left off tomorrow." With that, he walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Melissa turned to me, her arms crossed defensively. "What's this about, Ethan? I could ask you the same thing," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "You've been spending so much time here, so much time with him. I just wanted to see what's been keeping you away." Her face flushed with anger. "Brian is my coach. That's all. Are you seriously accusing me of something right now?" "I didn't say that," I said, taking a step closer. "But you have to admit, things have been different lately." She scoffed, grabbing her bag. "You know what, Ethan? If you don't trust me, maybe you should figure out why that is. I'm not doing this with you right now." And just like that, she walked out, leaving me standing alone in the freezing cold of the rink. For the first time, doubt crept in, loud and unrelenting. I wanted to believe her, but her reaction said it all. There was more to her late nights and secretive behavior than she was letting on. That was the night I decided to stop asking questions and start looking for answers myself. Melissa and I didn't speak much after that night at the rink. She gave me the cold shoulder for days, claiming she needed space to focus. Space? That was laughable, considering I hadn't felt close to her in months. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe I'd misread the situation. But the doubt gnawed at me. It didn't help that her phone had become her constant companion. She was always texting, her screen tilted just enough, so I couldn't see. When I asked who it was, her responses were vague. Just one of the skaters asking for advice, or a work thing, nothing important. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't the type to snoop. It felt beneath me, but the secrecy was driving me insane. While Melissa was in the shower, I grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it, my heart pounding in my chest. Her messages were innocuous at first. Texts to friends, family, and a few from parents of her skating students. But then I saw his name, Brian. There were dozens of texts between them, each more suspicious than the last. Brian, you looked incredible on the ice today. You always do. Melissa, stop it, LOL. I'm just trying to keep up with your crazy demands. Brian, you're more than keeping up. You're perfection. The final straw was a text from him sent just a few hours earlier. Brian, can't wait to see you tonight. Same time, same place? My stomach dropped. Same time, same place? What was that supposed to mean? I scrolled through their messages, hoping for some innocent explanation, but the more I read, the more it felt like the walls were closing in. When Melissa walked out of the bathroom, I was still standing there, phone in hand, frozen in disbelief. What are you doing with my phone? She asked, her tone sharp as she snatched it from me. I could ask you the same thing, I said, holding up a hand to stop her from interrupting. Who is Brian to you, Melissa? Because these messages don't sound like they're just about skating. Her face turned bright red, a mixture of anger and panic. You went through my phone? Are you serious right now? That's a total invasion of privacy. Privacy? I shot back, my voice rising. You've been sneaking around, lying to my face, and I'm supposed to worry about your privacy? Tell me the truth. What's going on with you and Brian? She crossed her arms, glaring at me. Nothing is going on. He's my coach, Ethan. That's it. Those texts are just banter. You're reading way too much into it. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the texts weren't banter, and the way she avoided my eyes told me everything I needed to know. You expect me to believe that? I said, my voice trembling. Because right now, Melissa, it feels like you're lying to me. She rolled her eyes, exasperated. I can't deal with this right now. I have practice tomorrow, and I need to sleep. With that, she stormed off to the bedroom, leaving me standing in the living room, clutching the sinking realization that my wife was slipping away, and not just to her skating. But I wasn't about to let this drop. If she wasn't going to give me answers, I was going to find them myself. That night, as I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, a plan began to form in my mind. I would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I was determined. The next morning, Melissa was gone before I even woke up. Her side of the bed was cold, her gym bag missing from its usual spot in the hallway. She left a note on the counter, something about an early practice session and not wanting to wake me. Under normal circumstances, I might have appreciated the gesture, but now it just felt like another excuse. I decided I wasn't going to sit idly by anymore. Melissa wasn't giving me the truth, so I'd have to dig it up myself. I started small, keeping track of her schedule and the places she claimed to be. It wasn't hard. She was meticulous about her skating calendar, leaving practice times and competition dates pinned to the fridge like a badge of honor. The problem was her routine didn't always add up. Practices that should have ended at 8 p.m. dragged on until 10 o'clock or later. Strategy meetings with Brian seemed to pop up at suspiciously odd hours. And then there was the credit card statement. One evening, while Melissa was at the rink, I went through our finances. We had a joint account, and normally, her transactions were pretty predictable. Coffee runs, skating gear, the occasional splurge on a new dress. But one charge stood out like a red flag. Dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. The date matched one of her late nights at practice, and the bill wasn't small. 2 entrees, dessert, and drinks. It didn't make sense. Melissa rarely ate out without me, and when she did, it was usually somewhere casual with her skater friends. My gut told me she hadn't been alone that night, and I had a pretty good idea of who her dinner companion was. I kept digging. One evening, after she went to bed, I searched for the restaurant's name in her messages. Sure enough, there was a text from Brian. Brian, last night was amazing. Same time next week. Melissa, of course. Just don't let me eat so much dessert this time, LOL. My hands shook as I read the exchange. There it was, proof that her late nights weren't about skating. But instead of confronting her right away, I decided to play it smart. If I came at her with accusations, she'd just deny it, like she had before. I needed more. The opportunity came a few days later, when Melissa said she had an out-of-town training session with Brian. She was vague about the details, something about a new rink an hour away, but I didn't press her. Instead, I waited for her to leave, then followed. I felt like a villain in a bad spy movie, tailing her car down the highway at a safe distance. My heart raced as I watched her pull into the parking lot of a boutique hotel. Not a rink, not even close. She didn't notice me as she parked and walked inside, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. 10 minutes later, Brian's black SUV pulled up beside her car, and he stepped out wearing a casual grin that made my blood boil. They didn't even try to hide it, walking into the hotel together like it was the most natural thing in the world. I sat in my car, staring at the entrance, my chest tight with anger and betrayal. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was confirmation. Melissa and Brian weren't just skating partners. They were something else entirely. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not here, not like this. If she was going to tear our life apart, I'd make sure she wouldn't walk away unscathed. That night, as I drove home alone, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about catching her in the act anymore. It was about taking back control of my life, one calculated move at a time. After seeing Melissa and Brian walk into that hotel together, something in me snapped. The shock I'd been feeling morphed into cold determination. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them make a fool out of me. No, if they wanted to play dirty, I could play smarter. The first step was gathering solid evidence. Stuff that wouldn't just prove their affair, but would also give me leverage when the time came. I wasn't going to let Melissa take everything I'd worked for, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let her walk away with a clean slate. I started small, tracking her movements more carefully. I installed a GPS tracker on her car, a little device I ordered online that fit neatly under her bumper. It felt invasive, but I told myself it was necessary. She wasn't being honest, so I had no choice but to take matters into my own hands. The results were enlightening. Melissa's practices were often nowhere near the rink. Instead, her car pinged locations at fancy restaurants, secluded parks, and, on more than one occasion, that same boutique hotel. Each time, Brian's SUV was there too. Next, I turned to her phone. I'd already seen the text between her and Brian, but I needed more. Photos, calls, anything incriminating. It took some digging, but I eventually installed monitoring software on her device while she was asleep. It let me see deleted messages and even track her location in real time. The things I uncovered were worse than I'd imagined. Late-night texts, flirty selfies, and even explicit messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. But what really got to me were the voice notes. Short recordings of Melissa laughing, teasing, and whispering things to Brian that she hadn't said to me in years. One message hit me harder than the rest. "Melissa, sometimes I feel like I'm just going through the motions with Ethan. With you, it's different. It feels real." Hearing those words was like a punch to the gut. I'd suspected the worst, but having it confirmed in her own voice was another level of pain. Still, I didn't let the anger consume me. Instead, I channeled it into action. With everything I'd gathered, GPS data, texts, voice recordings, I reached out to a lawyer, someone I trusted to keep things discreet. I laid everything out for her, and she confirmed what I'd been dreading. Melissa's actions could have serious consequences if I played my cards right. "Get as much as you can," she advised. "Emails, financial records, anything that shows a pattern of deception. The more evidence you have, the stronger your position will be." I took her advice and started looking into our finances. What I found made my blood boil. Melissa had been using our joint account to pay for her escapades, dinners, hotel rooms, even gifts. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was outright theft. I documented everything, keeping a meticulous record of her spending and her whereabouts. Every transaction, every text, every moment of her deceit was another piece of the puzzle I was assembling. But I didn't stop there. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done, not just emotionally, but financially and legally. My lawyer and I started drafting a plan, one that would protect my assets and ensure Melissa wouldn't walk away unscathed. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances at home, pretending everything was fine. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, sitting across from her at dinner, watching her smile and lie to my face. But I knew the endgame was worth it. I wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. I was preparing for the day I'd expose her and Brian for who they truly were to be. Why now? Every interaction with Melissa felt like a performance. She played the devoted wife when it suited her, but I could see the cracks in her facade. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way she'd avoid eye contact whenever I asked about her day, it all painted a picture of someone living a double life. But the real challenge wasn't just pretending everything was normal. It was staying patient. My lawyer, Karen, had made it clear that timing was critical. If I acted too soon, Melissa might deny everything or find a way to twist the narrative in her favor. So I waited. One day, I got the break I'd been hoping for. Melissa had forgotten to log out of her email on the home computer. My heart raced as I scrolled through her inbox, my stomach churning with every new discovery. It wasn't just her affair with Brian. It was worse than I thought. Melissa and Brian were making plans to leave. Emails between them outlined everything. Moving money into secret accounts, renting an apartment under a fake name, even discussing how they'd present the story to mutual friends. Brian, we need to time this right. Once the funds are moved, we'll have everything we need to start fresh. Melissa, I just want this over with. I can't keep pretending with Ethan anymore. The gall of it all? She wasn't just betraying me emotionally. She was plotting to dismantle my life entirely. I printed everything. The emails, the financial transactions, even the receipts for their secret dinners. Karen would have a field day with this evidence in court. But I wasn't ready to make my move yet. Instead, I decided to set a trap. I started playing the role of the clueless husband to perfection. I complimented her more, acted more affectionate, and even suggested we go out for dinner, something we hadn't done in months. Melissa seemed wary at first, but I could see the guilt creeping in. She wasn't used to me being so attentive, and it threw her off balance. The night before her next training trip, I made sure to casually ask where she'd be staying. Same hotel as last time? I asked, feigning innocence. She froze for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, they give us a discount because of Brian's connections. It's nothing fancy. I smiled, pretending to accept her answer, but inside, I was already planning my next move. When she left the next day, I followed her again, keeping a safe distance as she drove to the hotel. This time I wasn't just observing, I was documenting everything. Photos of her walking into the hotel with Brian, timestamps of their arrivals, and even video footage of them laughing and touching as they crossed the lobby. It was irrefutable proof. But the best part came later that evening. While they were inside, I used a contact from my lawyer, a private investigator, to access the hotel's public-facing security footage. We couldn't get into their room, of course, but we didn't need to. The lobby footage alone showed them checking in together, clearly more than just coach and skater. That night, I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. Melissa had been playing her game for months, but now, the board was mine. The weight of everything I had collected, emails, texts, financial statements, and now video evidence, felt like a ticking time bomb. I could have exploded then and there, confronting Melissa and Brian with everything I knew. But Karen urged me to stay the course. You've got them exactly where you want them, she said. Don't let emotion ruin the leverage you've built. And she was right. At home, Melissa's behavior grew more distant. She'd become so comfortable in her lies that she barely noticed how closely I was watching her. She came and went as she pleased, her training trips now a regular occurrence. Each time, I collected more evidence, strengthening my case. Meanwhile, Karen and I finalized the strategy. The goal was simple: expose the affair, shield myself from any financial fallout, and ensure that Melissa wouldn't walk away with a dime more than she deserved. The first step? Freezing our joint assets. Melissa didn't notice the changes right away. I'd moved most of the money into an account under my name, leaving just enough in the joint account to avoid suspicion. Karen also helped me file a motion to temporarily restrict any large withdrawals, a safeguard against Melissa and Brian's escape plans. Next, I started laying groundwork for the confrontation. I reached out to a few trusted friends, people who had been close to both of us over the years, and shared a carefully curated portion of the evidence. I didn't want to air all our dirty laundry, but I needed witnesses who could verify that I had tried to save the marriage and that Melissa's betrayal was undeniable. One of those friends, Jake, was particularly furious. She's been playing you this whole time, man, he said after seeing the texts. You deserve better. It felt good to have allies. For so long, I'd been fighting this battle in silence, but now I had people in my corner who understood the depths of what I was going through. The final piece of the puzzle came when I received an email from the private investigator. He'd been tailing Brian for weeks, and the report was damning. Brian wasn't just Melissa's partner in Betrayal. He'd also been involved in several shady business deals that could jeopardize his reputation as a coach. If he thought he could waltz out of this unscathed, he was sorely mistaken. With everything in place, I decided it was time to make my move. That evening, I suggested we have a date night. Melissa seemed surprised but agreed, probably thinking it would help maintain her charade. I reserved a table at one of her favorite restaurants, the same one where she and Brian had shared their secret dinners. As we sat across from each other, the air between us thick with unspoken tension, I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table. "I want to show you something," I said, my voice calm. Her smile faltered. "What is it?" I swiped through the gallery, showing her photos of her and Brian at the hotel, the lobby footage, and finally, the emails. Her face went pale, her fork clattering onto her plate. "Ethan," she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Don't," I said sharply, cutting her off. "Don't insult me with more lies. I know everything, Melissa. The late nights, the hotels, the money you've been funneling out of our account. You and Brian thought you could pull this off without me noticing?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I've given you every opportunity to come clean," I continued, my voice rising slightly. "But you chose to lie, to betray me, to treat me like I'm a fool. Well, I'm done playing along." Melissa's tears turned into sobs, but they felt hollow, performative. "It's not what it looks like," she finally managed to say. "Brian and it just happened. I didn't mean to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "It just happened? Months of lies, stolen money, and hotel rooms don't just happen, Melissa. You made choices, and now you'll face the consequences." She reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Please, Ethan, let's talk about this. We can fix it." I pulled my hand away. "Oh, we'll talk, all right? But not here. Not now. And not on your terms." As I got up to leave, I threw down enough cash to cover the bill. "Consider this your final act," I said coldly. "Enjoy the dinner. It's on me for the last time." That night, I filed the divorce papers. The day after I served Melissa with divorce papers, the house was silent. She stayed in the guest room, barely coming out except to grab coffee or make phone calls I pretended not to overhear. I could tell she was rattled. She knew I wasn't bluffing anymore. I wasn't cruel, but I wasn't accommodating either. Everything I did was deliberate, calculated. I made sure she knew the days of me bending over backward to make her happy were over. Meanwhile, Karen and I worked tirelessly to ensure my financial and parental interests were protected. "She's going to fight back," Karen warned during one of our meetings. "When people like Melissa lose control, they get desperate. Be prepared for anything." Melissa didn't wait long to show me exactly what Karen meant. A week later, I got a call from my boss. "Ethan, is everything okay at home?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "I got a strange email this morning, and I thought you should know about it." The email was from an anonymous account, filled with accusations about my temper and supposed financial mismanagement. It was a blatant attempt to smear my reputation at work, something Melissa must have concocted with Brian. Luckily, my boss dismissed it as nonsense, but the implications were clear. Melissa was going to play dirty. I started documenting everything. Every interaction, every conversation, every snide remark she made when she thought I wasn't listening. I wasn't about to let her paint me as the bad guy. The tension in the house grew unbearable. One night, as we passed each other in the hallway, Melissa stopped and turned to me. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice shaky. "We can work something out, without lawyers, without dragging this through court." I raised an eyebrow, my expression unreadable. "Work something out? Like what? Another secret deal with Brian?" She flinched, but I didn't back down. "Melissa, I gave you every chance to be honest, and you chose lies," I continued. "You made this mess. Now you get to live with the fallout." Her face hardened, the tears drying up almost instantly. "You think you're so righteous," she spat. "You think you've won. But you don't know everything, Ethan. You never did." I didn't respond. There was no point in engaging with her theatrics. The real bombshell came a few days later when Karen called me with an update. "We've traced the funds Melissa and Brian have been moving," she said. "It looks like they've been planning this longer than we thought. But there's something else. You might want to sit down for this." Turns out Melissa and Brian have been funneling money not just into secret accounts, but also into a side business Brian was running. A failing one at that. He'd been using Melissa's name on the paperwork, likely without her fully realizing what she was signing up for. If this came to light, it wouldn't just look bad for them. It could land them in legal trouble. "This could work in your favor," Karen said. "If she wants to fight, we got the upper hand. But you need to decide how far you want to take this." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of satisfaction. Melissa and Brian thought they could outsmart me, but they'd been careless, and now the web they spun was starting to trap them. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Anger, yes, but also relief. The pieces were finally falling into place, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I might actually come out of it stronger. Melissa had underestimated me, but I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The morning after Karen revealed Melissa and Brian's financial scheme, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. They had played their hand, and now it was my turn to show them what real strategy looked like. If Melissa thought she could walk away from this mess with her dignity, or her share of our life, she was sorely mistaken. Melissa tried to keep up appearances in front of the kids, playing the role of the dutiful mother, but I could see through it. The desperation was starting to show. I overheard her on the phone with Brian more than once, her voice tense as she tried to reassure him. "Ethan doesn't know about the accounts," she whispered one night, her words dripping with panic. "I've got it under control." Little did she know I was always one step ahead. Karen filed a motion to subpoena the financial records tied to Brian's side business, including Melissa's involvement. The evidence painted a damning picture, one of fraud, mismanagement, and outright deception. We were methodical, ensuring every piece of documentation was airtight. But I wasn't just relying on the courts. I wanted to make sure Melissa felt the consequences in every aspect of her life. One evening, I sat down with our kids, Emily and Jake. I kept it simple. They didn't need to know the gritty details, but I made sure they understood that things were changing. "Your mom and I are going through a tough time," I said gently, sitting between them on the couch. "We both love you very much, but we're going to live in separate places for a while." Emily's eyes welled up with tears, and Jake looked down at his hands. "Is it our fault?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "No, sweetheart," I said, wrapping an arm around her. "This has nothing to do with you. You're the best thing that's ever happened to us, and we'll always be here for you." Melissa walked in as I was finishing, her face pale. "What's going on?" she demanded, looking between me and the kids. I stood up, keeping my tone calm. "I'm being honest with them, Melissa. Something you might want to try for a change." She looked like she wanted to scream, but instead, she turned on her heel and stormed out. Later that night, I heard her on the phone again, her voice sharp and accusing. "He's turning the kids against me, Brian. This isn't fair." Fair? Coming from the woman who'd been scheming behind my back for months, the word felt like a joke. The next morning, I took things a step further. I contacted Melissa's skating clients, the parents who trusted her to guide their kids through the sport she once loved. I didn't reveal the affair outright, but I did mention her growing distractions and hinted that her focus might not be entirely on her students anymore. It was enough to plant seeds of doubt. Within days, the fallout began. Parents started pulling their kids from her coaching roster, citing concerns about her professionalism. Brian wasn't spared either. Word got out about his financial troubles, and a few of his high-profile clients decided to sever ties, leaving him scrambling. I wasn't just dismantling their relationship. I was unraveling the world they'd tried to build together. But I saved the best for last. Using the evidence Karen and I had compiled, I filed a countersuit in the divorce proceedings. Not only was I seeking full custody of the kids, but I was also demanding a majority share of our assets. The fraud tied to Melissa and Brian's schemes gave me more than enough leverage to justify my claims. The look on Melissa's face when she was served the papers was priceless. She didn't cry this time. She was too stunned. Instead, she glared at me, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and fear. "You're trying to destroy me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Melissa, irreplaceably. You destroyed yourself. Melissa's reaction to the countersuit was immediate and explosive. That night, after the kids were asleep, she stormed into the living room, slamming the legal papers onto the coffee table. "What the hell is this, Ethan?" she hissed, her face flushed with anger. I barely glanced up from my laptop. "It's exactly what it looks like," I replied calmly. "Full custody, majority assets. Considering the fraud and infidelity, I think it's more than fair." Her fists clenched at her sides, her voice shaking. "You're using the kids as pawns. You think you can just take them away from me?" I stood up, finally meeting her gaze. "I'm protecting them. From you, from Brian, from the chaos you've brought into this family. They deserve stability, and you can't provide that right now." She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself, her eyes darting away. For a moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in her for months: vulnerability. But I wasn't going to let my guard down. Not now. The next few days were a whirlwind. Melissa's lawyer tried to fight back, accusing me of being controlling and emotionally distant. But Karen was relentless. Every piece of evidence we'd gathered, the emails, the texts, the financial records, painted a clear picture of Melissa's betrayal. And then there was Brian. Karen suggested we bring him into the proceedings, not just as a witness, but as a co-conspirator. His involvement in the financial fraud and his affair with Melissa made him a key player in the case. It didn't take long for Brian to crack. Faced with the possibility of legal consequences and the loss of his coaching career, he turned on Melissa faster than I expected. In a signed affidavit, he admitted to the affair and detailed their plans to siphon money out of our accounts. When I read his statement, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Brian had been so smug, so confident that he and Melissa could outmaneuver me. Now, he was throwing her under the bus to save himself. Melissa, on the other hand, was unraveling. She tried to save face, putting on a brave front for the kids, but I could see the cracks in her armor. She spent hours on the phone with her lawyer, pacing the backyard as she tried to salvage what little leverage she had left. One afternoon, as I was leaving for a meeting with Karen, she stopped me in the hallway. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. "Can we just talk? Without the lawyers, without the accusations?" I stared at her for a moment, torn between the anger that still burned inside me and the faint memory of the woman I'd once loved. "Talk about what, Melissa?" I asked finally. "How you lied to me. How you stole from me. How you put Brian ahead of our family." She winced but held her ground. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't want this to get uglier than it already is. For the kids' sake." I nodded slowly, my expression unreadable. "You should have thought about that before you dragged us into this mess." With that, I walked out the door, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. At this point, there was no turning back. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was determined to come out on top, not just for myself, but for Emily and Jake. The ice was breaking, and Melissa was starting to realize just how thin it had always been. The weeks leading up to the court hearing were a masterclass in silent warfare. Melissa and I barely spoke, communicating only when necessary and always in clipped, measured tones. The kids picked up on the tension, and I hated how it affected them, but I reminded myself that this was temporary. Once this was over, they'd finally have the peace they deserved. Melissa tried to play the role of the wronged wife in public. She'd whisper to friends at school pickups and drop-offs, clearly spinning her version of events. But every attempt to rally support backfired as word of her affair and Brian's involvement began to spread. It wasn't just gossip anymore. Karen and I had filed additional evidence that tied Melissa and Brian to fraudulent financial activities. The legal community doesn't take kindly to deception, and Brian's coaching reputation was already in tatters. Parents pulled their kids from his program, and sponsors began distancing themselves. Melissa wasn't immune to the fallout either. Skating clients dropped her left and right. With Brian's business failing, she started to realize that the safety net she thought she had wasn't going to catch her. The court date finally arrived, and I'll admit, I was nervous. No matter how strong our case was, there was always a chance Melissa's theatrics could sway the judge. But when we walked into that courtroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. This was it. the moment I'd been building toward. Melissa and her lawyer tried to argue that I'd been neglectful, that her actions were a result of feeling unseen and unloved. It was a weak argument, and Karen dismantled it with precision, pointing to the months of deception and the clear financial trail of Melissa's betrayal. Then came Brian's affidavit. As Karen read it aloud, the courtroom was silent. Every detail of their affair, their schemes to move money, and their plans to run away together were laid bare. Melissa looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. The judge wasn't impressed. In her ruling, she granted me primary custody of Emily and Jake, citing Melissa's demonstrated instability and poor judgment. The division of assets heavily favored me, and the financial fraud tied to Brian's business ensured that Melissa wouldn't see a dime beyond the bare minimum for her own support. As we left the courtroom, Melissa stopped me in the hallway. "You got everything you wanted," she said bitterly, her eyes red from crying. "Are you happy now?" I stared at her, feeling a strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, and, surprisingly, pity. "This isn't about winning, Melissa. It's about protecting what matters. And you lost sight of that a long time ago." She didn't respond, just turned and walked away, her once confident stride now a shadow of what it had been. That night, as I tucked Emily and Jake into bed, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I could see a path forward, a future where the lies and betrayal didn't define us. Melissa and Brian thought they could ruin me, but in the end, they destroyed themselves. That I, in the weeks following the court's decision, I started to rebuild the life Melissa and Brian had tried so hard to dismantle. The house, once filled with tension and secrets, felt lighter, freer. Emily and Jake seemed happier too, though they still had questions I wasn't ready to answer in full. "Is Mom coming back?" Emily asked one evening as we played a board game. I hesitated for a moment before replying. "You'll still see her, sweetheart. But things are going to be different from now on. Sometimes people need space to figure out what's important." Jake, ever the sharp one, simply nodded. "I like it here. It feels better." It did feel better. Melissa had moved out, staying in a small apartment on the other side of town. She had visitation rights, but rarely exercised them. Whether it was guilt, embarrassment, or something else, I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. Brian, on the other hand, had completely disappeared from our lives. After the court ruling, his reputation was beyond repair. The skating world, small as it is, thrives on trust, and he'd lost that entirely. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to another state, trying to start over, but his name was already tarnished. And Melissa? Her downfall was just as swift. Losing her clients, her share of the assets, and her standing in the community hit her hard. She reached out once, asking if we could talk and find common ground. I refused. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I focused on moving forward. I threw myself into my work, earning a promotion that allowed me more flexibility to spend time with the kids. We started new traditions: movie nights, camping trips, Sunday pancake breakfasts. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned when Melissa and I first got married, but it was ours, and that made it enough. One day, while sorting through old boxes in the garage, I came across a scrapbook Melissa had made during our first year together. It was filled with photos of her competitions, the two of us smiling at the rink, and little notes she'd written about our future. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. Not for her, but for the life we'd built and lost. But then I closed the scrapbook and put it back on the shelf. That chapter was over, and I wasn't going to let it define me. Melissa had tried to ruin me, but she'd only made me stronger. I had my kids, my career, and most importantly, my peace. And that was a victory worth celebrating. While I focused on rebuilding my life, Melissa's world continued to crumble. Word of the court case and her affair with Brian had spread beyond our circle of friends. Her reputation, once bolstered by her accomplishments as a skater and coach, was in tatters. Her attempts to rebuild were clumsy at best. She tried launching a private coaching business but struggled to find clients willing to trust her. Parents didn't want their children associated with someone whose personal scandals had become public knowledge. Even her skating peers, the ones who once admired her, kept their distance. One evening, a mutual friend, Lisa, reached out. "Ethan, I ran into Melissa today, she said, her voice tinged with pity. She's not doing well. She mentioned having trouble keeping up with rent. I didn't respond right away. Part of me felt vindicated. Melissa had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. But another part, the one that had once loved her deeply, felt a flicker of pity. Lisa hesitated before adding, "She's different, Ethan." She seemed lost, like she didn't know how to move forward. I thanked Lisa for telling me and hung up, but her words stayed with me. Melissa had been so sure of herself, so confident in her ability to manipulate and control. Now, she was just a shadow of the person I once knew. A week later, Melissa showed up unannounced at the house. It was the first time I'd seen her in months, and she looked rough, tired, disheveled, and clearly struggling. "I just want to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't invite her in, but stepped onto the porch to hear her out. "I know I've messed up," she began, her hands trembling. "I lost everything, Ethan. The skating, the clients, the money, it's all gone. And Brian, he left. He said I wasn't worth the trouble." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Was this an apology? A plea for help? "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "I've hit rock bottom, and it's all my fault. I don't know how to fix it." Her vulnerability caught me off guard, but I refused to let my guard down. "Melissa, I'm sorry you're going through this," I said, my tone measured. "But you made choices that hurt me, the kids, and yourself. I can't fix this for you. That's something you'll have to figure out on your own." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "I guess I just needed to hear you say that." As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure. Melissa's downfall wasn't something I had orchestrated. It was the natural consequence of her actions. I wasn't responsible for her pain, but I hoped she could learn from it, the way I had learned from mine. Melissa didn't come around again after that visit. Maybe she realized there was nothing left to salvage, or maybe she finally understood that the life we had was gone. Either way, her absence was a relief. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Emily and Jake adapted to the changes with a resilience I hadn't expected. Their laughter filled the house again, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt a sense of peace. One weekend, we decided to go ice skating, a spur-of-the-moment trip that reminded me of the early days with Melissa. At first, I hesitated, wondering if it would stir up old memories, but the kids were excited, so I pushed my doubts aside. As we laced up our skates and stepped onto the ice, I couldn't help but smile. Emily clung to my arm, giggling as she wobbled, while Jake took off like he'd been skating for years. It was chaotic and imperfect, but it was ours. Afterward, as we sat in the stands sipping hot chocolate, Emily looked up at me. "Are you happy, Dad?" she asked, her big brown eyes filled with curiosity. I paused, caught off guard by the question. "I think I am," I said finally, wrapping an arm around her. "Because I have you and Jake. That's all I need." Over the next few months, I focused on building a life that didn't revolve around the past. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, and even started dating again. Not seriously, but enough to remind myself that I could still find joy outside of what I'd lost. One evening, as I was tucking Jake into bed, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Mom made mistakes, didn't she?" I nodded, choosing my words carefully. "Yes, she did. But we all make mistakes, buddy. The important thing is learning from them and trying to be better." He seemed to think about that for a moment before smiling. "You're better, Dad." Those simple words hit me harder than anything Melissa had ever said or done. In the months and years that followed, I built a new version of happiness, a version that didn't include Melissa or the shadow of her betrayal. The kids thrived, I thrived, and the weight of the past faded into something manageable, something that no longer defined me. I learned that betrayal, no matter how painful, doesn't have to be the end of the story. It's just a chapter, one that teaches you how to rise, rebuild, and find strength you never knew you had. And that's exactly what I did.